Right. Thank you so much, all of you. I'm just going to put 3 or 4 points in front of you, and then we'll open the House for questions. And since my job is to play the role of devil's advocate, let me just put down 2 or 3 points. The first is about the elections. Now, elections are supposed to be held on the 28th of September, but should they be held? Will there be a bloodbath if they are held? And if they are held, will the new government, whatever it is, whoever it is, will it be a legitimate one? The second is, I'm just wondering, Saad, if Afghans are horrified enough what are they saying about the secret talks at Camp David? I think we were all astounded that something like this could even take place, but maybe because things are so bad, was it just one more thing that people took in their stride on Sunday morning? So that's one question from me. My third point is that, amongst the 5 of you, actually, Pakistan, the word Pakistan didn't come up that much, and that's pleasantly surprising. Of course, Ambassador Mukhopadhyay referred to it, and Ambassador Jayant Prasad in the analogy in 2006, the Helmand analogy when the Musa Kala agreement. But can we perhaps, all of you, could talk a little bit more about the Pakistani role? As Ambassador Prasad said, it's difficult to do a deal without the Pakistanis and what kind of a role they will play. And perhaps the last point that I have on my here is if you do have a progressive Afghanization of the security forces, which you are having, and as Ambassador Qadiri said, that they are taking back districts from the Taliban. But the point is that why isn't the rest of the world, and may I ask all you former Indian ambassadors to Afghanistan, why is it that India is still holding back and not perhaps providing military equipment? You keep talking about doing that. You keep saying that the Afghans are happy, but why not do much more? So these are some of my points, but so I'm opening this up to the House. First question. Charlie? I have a question. Okay. Who has a question? Go ahead, the gentleman in the green shirt.
I'm Hari. I'm a freelance person. My question is the superpower of America so scared that they can't take out their army from there? If they cannot take out, then they committed a blunder. Why the hell they went there?
No, they went there.
They cannot take out their army from there.
They want to take out, which is what this is about. But perhaps I think if you allow me to turn your question around, how desperate was Donald Trump that he wanted to get the troops out, which forces him to call the Taliban to Camp David, no less, in the anniversary of September 11?
Well, Donald Trump, I think, has relied mostly on his inner circle, and has pretty much allowed Pompeo to monopolize this entire process. So the interagency process would be the way to deal with a situation like this has been completely neglected. In terms of your questions, and Pakistan's a very valid one, but in the eyes of Ambassador Khalilzad and probably Pompeo, the Pakistanis are playing a constructive role because they're saying all the right things.
Do you agree with that?
Well, based on history and past performance, the answer to that is no. So to use that expression, trust but verify, is probably very appropriate for this. I think the extraordinary thing is that how they're neglecting their friends, whether it's the Europeans or the Brits or the Indians for that matter, relying more on the Pakistanis, and neglecting their allies, which is the Afghan government and the Afghan National Security Forces, and opting to be more supportive of the Taliban. I have to remind you that since 2014, the Afghan National Security Defense Forces have lost 50,000 men. So it's been a huge sacrifice. And I think to an extent, we all know President Ghani, and he can be a bit difficult, and I think that initially he should have taken the initiative in terms of putting together a fairly inclusive negotiating team that could go and talk to the Taliban. He dragged his feet and to an extent forced the Americans to find other ways of putting a group together. But it's what legitimacy will this negotiating team have? And one of the interesting discussions that Ambassador Khalilzad and President President Ghani have had, is that the Americans have been insisting on an inclusive negotiating team that has authority. In other words, it can act and decide on major issues without consulting with Kabul. So that, in effect, what I think Ambassador Khalilzad is trying to do is that take the veto power away from President Ghani. So you can see where this is heading.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Can I just add one thing?
Yes.
I would just say that perhaps it was not desperation of President Trump, but he was definitely determined that he wanted to meet a certain deadline. The desperation or the perception of desperation came from the way the entire deal was negotiated, actually. It was not the starting point. In fact, he could as well go back to his South Asia policy, where it is condition-based rather than a political-based withdrawal. But the way it was negotiated and the way the timeline shifted from initial 18 months withdrawal to 14 months, and if you calculate from today, where does 14 months end? It is the US elections. It's very clear. Even the reduction from 8,000 to 5,000, it was brought down to 135, 153 days from 6 months. And the intra-Afghan dialogue was also given 14 months. That means while the elections happen, there is still a semblance of some dialogue happening. What is the outcome? Because after the dialogue was supposed to be the Loya Jirga, which would have decided the future. So my sense is that there is a political need to change the definition of this war. This war, please remember, they came in as a global war on terror. So it is their responsibility. And he keeps saying he's not the policeman. Once he withdraws and intra-Afghan talks fail in 14 months and there is a civil war, the argument would be there's no longer a global war on terror. It's an inter-ethnic Afghan conflict. So this is how I see it, that it has been now actually completely driven by the political calendar. So it's not desperation, but his determination to reduce is very clear right from the day he was a candidate.
Okay. Before I ask Ambassador Ashok Sajjanhar, ladies and gentlemen, it's been remiss of me. This discussion has been organized by the Center for Policy Research. So it is being live streamed. So if you log on to the CPR website and the print, which is where I work. So the print, so it's YouTube/the print, one word. Ambassador Sajjanhar.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have two questions. Anyone?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Anyone might wish to answer. One is, how much was Mike Pompeo invested in these discussions? How much was he involved? Was he on board? Because at the end of the day, he refused to sign the paper. And maybe, that is something that we saw of things coming. After that, Mr. Trump came out and said that he's walking out of the deal. My second question is, we are saying that negotiations will resume, the talks will go. Will it be in the same format in terms of US and Taliban? Is there a role for regional countries? Is there a role for regional powers? After all, there are a large number of other formats. There is the Moscow format, there is the Kabul format, there is the Quad, there is Uzbekistan also had all of them get together, including they wanted Taliban.
Right.
So what is the role of all these? Meaning, do they have a role to play going forward? Because after all, as was mentioned, I think by Saad, that peace is what everyone wants. And I think peace is wanted most of all by the regional countries, by the neighboring countries.
Right.
And here we have excluded all of them. So
Sure.
do they have, in the negotiations going forward, talks going forward, what is the role that they can play?
Okay.
Thank you.
Do you want to take the first question and I'll ask Ambassador
On the regional efforts? Or?
No, on the first one is that why did Pompeo?
Well, I think just the idea was initially that they would announce in three places. They would announce the Taliban deal in Doha, and Ambassador Khalilzad would do that. And they would announce the Kabul deal, because the Afghan government is also signing a document with the Americans in Kabul, and they were thinking of the Secretary of Defense and the NATO Secretary General who'd attend that. And then they would have a third announcement in Oslo. They were trying to sequence that before this Camp David thing came up. So I think that this whole idea of Pompeo not wanting to sign it is probably a little bit exaggerated, because the whole idea was for someone else to be present and to sign that document. So I think I wouldn't pay too much attention to that. But Pompeo, this is his gig. He's going to own this peace deal, and this could be part of his legacy. I mean, rumors that he's going to run for the Senate, and he's going to leave in a few months to pursue that, so then he can run for office in, 2024. But just to clarify that.
Thank you. And regarding the other question before, getting to that, I think His Excellency Mr. Amarasena was just talking about the elections. Let me also add that elections will not contradict, actually, the will of the Afghan government and the will of the Afghan people to make peace. Because peace is something that, the Afghan people, they have been wanting it and expecting it for a really long time. But what they really want is a long-lasting and enduring peace. A peace which will ensure, actually, the safety of the generations to come. So not something which should be rushed, because I was quite recently in Kabul, and when I was speaking to my friends and colleagues, everyone was really concerned. They had some legitimate concerns regarding the future of a deal that they don't know what might happen. So, that's why they have been drawing some of the red lines, for example. And the red lines, again, they were quite legitimate, because we have come a really long way. I mean, the reason why I talked about 9/11 was that was exactly the same stage that we were in fear. And we were, in doldrums. We didn't know, what might happen next. So the friends I was speaking to, in this situation, they were in the same situation. They are, asking, what might happen next? What happens to the gains that we have, achieved over the last 18 and 19 years? The freedom of expression, which is a good example. The good example is Tulu News, for example. The freedom of women's rights, and the other achievement that we have received in terms of, building up institutions in Afghanistan. So that is one of, I think, the biggest red lines that, everyone asks, what comes next? So, are we compromising these values and principles for return for something which we don't know it might last? Getting to the other question, negotiations, if negotiations will resume, I think it is a very good break and good pause for all the stakeholders to look, to look into the contents of what they have discussed so far and to see what they have agreed on and what might be the next steps. And it's very good for the people of Afghanistan. In fact, it gave the Afghan people a good break as well. The people who I've been speaking to, I mean, they feel everyone was really, confused and scared at the same time. What next? What might happen next? So I think it was a good break for them and for the democracy to be practiced in Afghanistan on 28th of September. So that was a good chance for the elections as well to go ahead, because that is, what every single Afghan wants. I know that we have challenges. I know that, the security challenges we have, but the Afghan government has got a plan in terms of security and in terms of the transparency as well, to ensure that, the elections which will happen, that will be transparent enough to have, a winner at the end. I think it is very crucial to include the regional countries to build a consensus. I know the Afghan government, they engaged with the international community. I mean, we can name some of the conferences like the Tashkent, the Geneva, and the Heart of Asia. And in the region as well, they engage with many countries, including Pakistan, to bring them on board when it comes to peace in Afghanistan, because we have always insisted that peace in Afghanistan ensures the security and stability for the region, especially that we are talking about an era in Afghanistan where we are no more a landlocked country, but we are a land-bridged country. We have the air corridor, we have the air, we are now connected actually to the region. Quite recently, the first goats from Afghanistan were exported to China, for example. In the north of the country, there is a train station which goes all the way to Central Asia and then from there to Europe. So that is the kind of, era we are talking about. So it's very important to include actually the region and to bring them on board, to ask their concerns, because all the region, they have stakes in Afghanistan. And as one of the excellencies rightly said that, it is the peace in Afghanistan, I think, more than anyone, the regional countries, they need peace, especially for the, economic prosperity. Thank you.
You sent goats to China?
Yes. Well, not animals. I mean, like stuff. They sent, some of these stones to China. Yeah.
Gold.
No, stop. No, goods. Not animals, no. Stop.
I am so sorry.
We'll export goats to India.
We want cows. Do you have any cows? We can do with cows. Ambassador Vijay Nambiar, you were ambassador to Afghanistan when?
At the risk of sounding antediluvian, do we see shades of 1992? You're talking of, because in some ways the rug is being taken out of the feet of the government, of the established government in Kabul. Then, now too, if this is going to happen, and was it anything about peace or just about getting out of the country? I'd like some of you to reflect on the shades of the 1992, because at that time too, Pakistan was very much there.
So you were ambassador from 92?
90 to 92.
90 to 92.
I was there during Najib's days, and then when the April to June, right, I was dean of the diplomatic corps then.
Okay.
And then, of course, all hell broke loose then.
Right.
But I see very much of the shades of 1992 here, except that the actors are completely different now. And I don't think that the United States is collapsing the way Soviet Union collapsed at that time, because this was the time when the coup had taken place, etc. April and June of 1992. But I see great resonances, and in some ways, we are not talking of democracy now. It's hardly, people are not talking about the establishment of democracy. It's just the question of just hitting and breaking loose, and it's the same people who will be coming. At that time, of course, you had a different set of mujahideens, but Mohammadi, in fact, in some ways, the Harakat was consisted of many of the same people, new generations. It's an entire new generation now. But I don't, it's exactly plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose.
Okay. Gautam, may I ask you to take that? And Ambassador
Not at
Jain
all
Prasad.
antediluvian. I think if the Khalilzad deal had gone through, this was very likely what would have happened. I find it, in fact, I want to pose this question to Saad. How could an unofficial delegation carry authority? What is the legal mechanism for an unofficial delegation to carry authority and sanctity? Number one. Number two, this entire process of 14 months was going to take place in a constitutional vacuum. In a constitutional vacuum, in a country as fractious and divided as Afghanistan, and now not just divided amongst the Republican forces, but also among the Islamist forces, that includes the appearance of ISIS, this would have been a recipe for conflict, instability, and eventually a kind of post-1992 situation. Post-1992, you had the Taliban. But after what has happened in Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, I dread to think what the new incarnation of the Taliban in Afghanistan. No Taliban then, but now after the ISIS phenomenon, I dread to think what would be the incarnation of this particular thing. I also want to address this whole question of how to move ahead the peace process. I think I drew some red line, but the fact is that the elections offer you an option or a possibility of a genuinely Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, and possibly Afghan-controlled peace process. But one of the first steps necessary for that is forging a common position. I think successive Afghan governments from 2010, when the idea of reconciliation was accepted at the conference, have failed to actually put together a common Afghan position. The Loya Jirga that was held was a very big step, but very late. And I think what needs to be done is put together a common Afghan position so that you can actually negotiate with the Taliban. Now, the Taliban will not come to you now if they didn't come to you yesterday. So pressure needs to be put on the Taliban to come to the table. And I think this is the important thing. It is not sufficient to put military pressure on the Taliban alone. Basically, the international community must exercise every instrument in its hand to be able, the route to peace through Afghanistan is through Pakistan, and they should exercise every instrument available, financial and otherwise, to make Pakistan support this peace process. And I think, this is also very critical.
Ambassador Prasad, can I ask you to pick up on what Gautam just said? Can you make Pakistan accept a peace process like this?
As I said before, you can try, but it's going to be very, very difficult, because even today, despite the slow process of change in Pakistan, there is a change in Pakistan, but not far enough, not enough that the control of policy that they have towards Afghanistan and towards India will or towards nuclear weapons use goes out of the hands of the military. The process of change in Pakistan is rather slow, and the demand in Afghanistan is for quick peace. So there is a mismatch. I'm not very hopeful that Pakistan will play ball. But who knows? Maybe they do if there is sufficient persuasion.
Right. Saad, are you hopeful Black Pakistan will play ball? And also to Gautam's question about talks taking place in a constitutional vacuum.
Well, Pakistan obviously should be engaged, given that the Taliban are based in Pakistan and their close relationship with the Pakistani military and its intelligence agency, the ISI. But so should the others. And one of the big issues we've had is this lack of transparency. Ambassador Khalilzad failed to share his documents with the National Security Advisor. If he was that protective of what he was working in, he's excluded everyone else as well, including our international allies. The NATO senior people were not aware of exactly what was being discussed. The Germans were not aware of what was being discussed. I'm certain the Indians were not privy to what was being discussed. So I think transparency is very important, and the region can play an important role, not just in terms of guaranteeing this deal, but also in terms of economic development, investment, and everything else. I just want to throw something in before I address Gautam's point. I'm on the board of the International Crisis Group with President Santos of Colombia. And I put this question to him over a year ago. I said, what would we need? What did you need in order to deliver the deal that you delivered? He said, first and foremost, momentum on the battleground. B, regional consensus. C, empowering local commanders to do local deals across the country. Last but not least, the two sides to recognize each other. If you look at those four things, pretty much none of them exist in Afghanistan. We don't really have regional consensus. Yes, I think everyone is paying lip service, but we haven't had everyone in a room deciding that this is the best thing for us. So, and to Gautam's point about negotiating team and the authority, it has to derive its authority from the state. And there cannot be we have a constitution. So even if we renegotiate our constitution, the old constitution should stand, the order should stand until we have a new constitution and new elections. It always sounds good in terms of having an interim administration, transitional government, all those sorts of things. But in reality, I can't see the mechanism that would deliver us that. And I certainly, that sort of an arrangement would make things a lot murkier and would cause a lot more instability in the country, I believe.
Mujib, you have a question? Yeah. And after that, Ambassador Yash Sinha, I can't see you, but after this.
My question is if anybody in the panel could be able to shed some light with regard to the Chinese component to this crisis. What sort of intervention over past several years we've been hearing that China has become far more proactive in Afghan affairs. So what could be the possible strategy that you anticipate that China must be having with respect to post-withdrawal, or for that matter, how the China-Pakistan axis could contain Indian interests or Indian role in Afghanistan? I would certainly appreciate that if someone can comment on that.
Gautam, would you like to take that? And then Saad, perhaps?
China has not been at complete ease China has not been at complete ease with what is happening in Afghanistan, which is why they have, they have joined statements in BRICS and various other outfits actually condemning, in fact, even naming Pakistan as a sponsor of terrorism in some selected cases. But the fact of the matter is that in the end, China will back Pakistan. It will never betray or abandon Pakistan. So I think that is their position right now. But when it comes to the possibility of what I said was the economic component of of Afghanistan being able to stand on its own feet in future, then I think China, Iran, India could be among the three regional countries that could have an interest and the capacity to invest, in particular in the mineral sector in Afghanistan, from which they would be able to generate the revenues necessary to support the state.
Would you like to say something?
Well, Afghan view.
Well, I think the ambassador is right. The Chinese are not, they're very careful, and their assistance to Afghanistan is is not substantial. But Afghanistan is now part of the One Belt, One Road project. They have their issues with radical Islam, but at the same time they have their relationship with Pakistan. I think they're going to tread very carefully. But I think in a post-settlement environment, the Chinese can play a significant role. At the end of the day, it's going to be the region that's going to invest in Afghanistan, not companies out of Europe or the U.S.
Okay. Ambassador Yash Sinha. Hi.
Thank you, Jyoti. I just a comment and a question. A comment on Pakistan. I mean, we've been wringing our hands about the role of Pakistan since time immemorial, I think, at least since Pakistan was formed. And the problems in Afghanistan attributed to Pakistan are well known. We also be talking about, not just us, the international community, about cleaning the swamp, and that's where the problem lies. And we've been doing it for so many years, and yet we seem to be falling back on Pakistan's cooperation in trying to achieve a deal. Of course, you need everybody's cooperation, particularly Pakistan's. But I think the time has really come to call a spade a spade. I mean, we just saw what happened in the talks with the US. That is a comment. And the question is more regarding India's role, India's consultations with a reference to regional countries and, of course, extra-regional countries. I mean, we had a very good dialogue which we started with the United States and Afghanistan in a trilateral format in 2013. That seemed to have died an unnatural death, if I could put it that way. And we had consultations at the bilateral level with Russia every year. I think that still continues. And obviously with Iran and other players. So I think it's very important at this stage to pick up those pieces. And I wanted to ask the panel what they thought about these other formats. I mean, Heart of Asia was mentioned certainly from the Istanbul process, but there are many other processes in a multilateral format. But should India be talking not just bilaterally, but with like-minded countries on how to proceed?
Thank you. Ambassador, would you like to, why don't you call a spade vis-a-vis Pakistan?
Well, I think Afghanistan's position has always been very clear that, we are quite concerned about cross-border, insurgency. And that is, it needs joint and united steps, actually. It needs to be taken, by the regional countries. And that is why, His Excellency, our President, he recently engaged with the region, including Pakistan, regarding that. So I think the position of the Afghan government is quite clear regarding that. So safe Afghanistan is a safe region.
Ambassador Prasad?
There is one bit of good news that since the time I used to be in Kabul about 10 years ago, the Afghan-China relationship has developed. Because at that time, China was interested in Afghanistan. But when Afghans would catch some terrorists and want to hand them over to China from Xinjiang, the Chinese would not even accept them or come and interrogate them. Now it's different. Now they are paying attention to what's going on in Afghanistan. Because 4 years ago, Pakistan pushed out all the terrorists who were involved in Xinjiang and Central Asia from Pakistan to Afghanistan. from Fatah to the eastern Afghanistan. And thereby they shifted the problem of terrorism from their territories into Afghan territory. So now China is compelled to talk to Afghanistan seriously on counter-terrorism. And there is a possibility that if there is peace, the Chinese will be more prepared today to exert pressure in favor of Afghanistan than, let's say, 10 years ago. And talking of the past, Ambassador Nambiar, one person from your time is a presidential candidate, Hekmatyar.
Shall we talk a little bit about Hekmatyar? Yeah. Is about Hekmatyar?
So the question I was going to ask is...
Yes. Would you just like to say who you are? I'm so sorry.
The IFS officers here know me. I'm Premila Nazareth.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm Premila Nazareth. I used to work at the UN. Now I do independent things. So my question is, could you throw a little light on the shifts within the Taliban itself? Do we see a more moderate face emerge? And if by chance the agreement goes through and they take part in the election, and the Taliban comes to power through a democratic election, is the world going to accept it? Or is it going to be like what happened in Algeria, where the West suddenly decides it has to intervene and restore the convenient parties? So what may happen then?
Right. I think there are... Hekmatyar probably, Saad, has killed more Afghans than anyone else.
Well, I think that ship has sailed. I think the Taliban now have legitimacy. There's a scramble to run to Doha to meet with them. Everyone's met with them. And I think the Indians should also engage them. I think that...
What about within Afghanistan?
Within Afghanistan...
Do the mass of Afghani people see the Taliban as someone who represents them?
Depends. Well, the majority of Afghans would prefer not to have the Taliban. The Taliban's approval rating has never, we've done many surveys and we've looked at many surveys, have never exceeded nationally 15%. It's sort of between 10 and 15%. And then their strongholds, it's more like 30%, and possibly because people are under pressure and they vote or they endorse the Taliban. The one thing you got to remember about Afghanistan is that Afghanistan's median age is 18. It's the youngest country outside of Africa. Afghanistan, which was 80% rural maybe 20 years ago, is now 50-50. These cities have really have developed in that period. 80% of the population has a TV set. 80% of the population has a mobile phone. A third to half the population has internet, has access to the internet. So you're dealing with a very young, impressionable population that's very aspirational. It's very different to the Afghanistan of 20 years ago. What's interesting is if you look at the polls, they despise the Taliban less than their parents because they never experienced it. So I think, interestingly, they're more receptive to the idea of including the Taliban in talks and so forth because they've never experienced the Taliban rule. Can the Taliban change? Listen, the Taliban...
Has it changed? How has it evolved?
I don't know if it's changed. I mean, they're killing a lot of people. They're acting in the same manner they acted in 1995 and 6 and 7 and 8. I'm not sure if they've changed. I think strip the Taliban of their ideology, they're like any other Afghan group. They need that ideology. It's their oxygen. Their insistence on an emirate allows them, a la Iran, to sit above the government and to have a religious leader on top of that. They will never abandon that ideology, certainly not publicly, because it will completely strip them of any legitimacy they have. That's my thinking, anyway.
Yeah, sure.
Can I just
Yes.
add to this? Yeah,
Yes,
after
please,
you.
please.
After you.
Okay.
No,
In fact, something to add to what Mr. Mohsini just said. I believe, one of the reasons why the Taliban became very delusioned was that, many countries approached them, and they gave them a kind of platform that they are now speaking from a position of strength rather than from a position of weakness. But the reality on the ground is, it seems, to the friends that I speak to, they feel that it seems like as if we are integrating into the Taliban, not the Taliban integrating into us. So it needs to be the Taliban needs to integrate into Afghan society. So, the generation that I'm talking about, you know, they have not got stuck in the history. This is a new generation which is like very equipped, like, you know, they are connected to the world, they know the language, they have studied outside and even inside the country. So that is a kind of generation we are talking about. So now the biggest question is that how much have the Taliban changed? Because the society in the country has changed, as I said. I mean, a new generation with lots of hopes and education and things like that. So I think the Taliban need to come out and say that they have changed and they will be integrating into the Afghan society. I think we don't see a lot of change actually in the attitude and behavior that they showed recently. Killing and slaughtering the children, attacking schools, you know, who can justify this, in fact? Or, you know, killing people who are like celebrating, like, you know, a wedding hall, in a wedding hall. So how could you justify that? That is the reason why I think this was a good break and pause, in fact, to listen to the concerns of the Afghan people, to see what the Afghan people really want. Because as Mr. Mohsini said, there was a bit of confusion as well. I mean, there was not so much clarity and transparency in the way that these talks were going on. Like, on what basis will the Taliban really embrace the Afghan constitution? Because that is the red line. They named the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. That's the red line. When you talk to the younger generation, these are, you know, some of the red lines that they cannot go back and they cannot accept a setback, for example. So that is why, you know, the main concern and, well, the main demand of the young Afghan or the Afghans in general is a dignified and meaningful, you know, peace deal, something which should ensure that, you know, the Taliban will integrate, the Taliban will accept, and they will compromise. But I'm surprised actually to hear that some of the basic concerns of the Taliban today is that how a woman should cover herself, rather than how a woman should get education, for example. So that is, you know, something which really contradicts. And I think the Taliban need to come out and say that, no, I mean, they have changed.
Don't be surprised, Ambassador. Men in India are about the same. So don't be surprised.
May I just add?
Yes, yes.
Her question, whether they have moderated or not, what is the yardstick, really, by which you judge? So you will have to perhaps look at 3 or 4 different issues. First, I would say whether use of violence to achieve. Have they moderated there? Answer is no. Socially, I don't think there is any indication except what they told the Americans. And I can quote exactly what they have agreed in that agreement, whatever we know, is that yes, in terms of women's rights, education, freedom of speech, it'll all be under as per umbrella of Islam and Afghan cultural norms. Now, you can interpret it either way. Now, is that sign of moderation? I don't know. Third, politically, answer is clear no, because they have insisted, and most probably it has been conceded, that they're going to sign that agreement at Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan. Now, Emirates and democracy, I don't know where it will go. Separately, there are indications that they are talking of a different model, where they may have elections, choose a prime minister or a president, but still have some sort of a supreme council, like the Iranians, which is ulemas, which approves every legislation, every order, is vetted as per Sharia and approved. So I guess their insistence on Islamic Emirates, and that is the fearful part, is that this basically amounts to US retrospectively or ex post facto recognizing Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan after 18 years. And this answers your question. We never mentioned Pakistan because we don't have to mention the obvious. This negotiation right now is really US-Pakistan negotiations. Taliban is the front. No, we have to be very clear. The intra-Afghan part is where the Pakistan and other regional countries may have a say. But as of now, the Americans have to understand that they are recognizing what was Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan, the regime, created, nurtured, brought to Kabul by Pakistan. And that is what they are getting, that international recognition of IEA. So on all these, and of course, attitude to minorities. Well, you just look around, the attack on the wedding or killing of the Hazara piece. So on all these, while there are a lot of hope that it has changed because suddenly they have taken on a new garb and they're being presented as international diplomats, being feted in every chancery. So there's a certain glow of diplomacy around them. But at the core, I don't see any sign of change. Well, this is my personal view.
Yeah, sorry. I'm so sorry. I think you've asked a couple of questions, so we'll have to go with that later. So, yeah.
I just want to say one thing, that I've been here twice in the last couple of months. There's a great deal of frustration in Delhi. Last time I came, I followed Zal. I think he left and I came the next day. The Indians are, obviously the Indian government is not happy. I'm not sure about the Indian public, even if they're aware of what's going on. The problem for the Indian government is that they've got a very passive approach to what's transpiring in Afghanistan, and even a passive approach in terms of their dealings with Washington. It reminds me of the time that the Australian Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull at the time, wanted to connect with Donald Trump. He had to go and use the golfer Greg Norman to connect to Donald Trump. You know, the way that things used to work with Washington is no longer working. And on Afghanistan, I think you need to have a very proactive approach. Otherwise, you're going to miss the boat. I mean, I think a lot of people are now saying, well, that was close. We knew this was going to fail. But you don't realize how close it was to getting done. So the Indians have to literally get off their backsides, hire or appoint a special envoy that would deal with this, that can engage not just the Americans and the Brits and the Europeans and the NATO folks, but also the regional powers. I mean, Iran has a role to play, a significant role, but India is probably in a much better position to engage the Iranians than, say, the Americans. The Indians have historical relations with the Russians and therefore the Central Asians. I think you can play a very constructive role there. So I think that no one's going to invite you. You know, you have to barge in and have your say in this. So last time I mentioned in a number of meetings that you need to have that special envoy, because I think your foreign secretary, your foreign minister, they've got too many other things on their hands. I think you need someone fully dedicated to this. And it's very important because otherwise, in 10 years' time, it will be an opportunity lost for the region. If the Taliban were to return, they will be an instrument of our neighbor Pakistan. And Pakistan is going to hedge its bets. It's going to have other groups inside of Afghanistan. The Taliban will probably fragment. Insurgency will continue. The question is, it's going to be low temperature or high temperature insurgency. Either way, it's not good news for Afghanistan. Therefore, it's not going to be good news for India and the region.
Right. Gautam, would you like to take that? That India should do much more, that you've been playing a very passive role, and that nobody is going to ask you, you have to barge in?
Right. Well, thank you. Firstly, I completely agree with both Saad as well as Amar on both the issue about the Taliban and whether they have changed, and on the issue of playing a more active role, including the appointment of a special envoy. On one small point on the Taliban, if they actually accepted the Republic and agreed to contest elections, as in some ways Hekmatyar has done, then frankly it's an intra-Afghan, it's an Afghan process, an Afghan decision, and I don't think we would come in the way of that kind of exercise of. The problem is that they simply do not accept elections as a mechanism to test their legitimacy to govern. That comes from something else, and that comes from the Emirates. So I think that's the point on that. On the Indian role, I think there are several things that could be done. As a special envoy is one. I think we could have played it at earlier stage a role in arguing that the Afghan government should be represented by the Afghans should be represented by a representative Afghan delegation under the umbrella of the government or the High Peace Council, as it was then. And we could have played a role in trying to forge that kind of national consensus on, say, something like in bringing the Afghans together. You know, I've always maintained two things. One is that there is very little Afghanistan can do about Pakistan and the Taliban, and there is very little Afghanistan can do about US policies, which have flipped and flopped repeatedly. The only thing that is in their own hands is their own national consensus and unity. And that, unfortunately, that thing which is in their own hands has very rarely been exercised. So I think, you know, this is one issue. I think India can do much more. We have done a lot in the area of reconstruction, but there are ways and methods. We could do much more. We could have done more in terms of actually investing, in the mineral sector, but also in the livelihood sector, in terms of processing and packaging and help marketing many of their agri-based products. This was not done. I think we could do a lot more in projecting or amplifying the Afghan voice, which has been totally missing in the last few years. And I think we could play a much larger role in international diplomacy around Afghanistan. I think we have been absent in all these areas.
Well, that's an admission. Ambassador Tahir Qadri, what do you think? Do you think India has been passive and we should do much more, and in what way?
Well, that's a very tough question. I don't know. I need to mix up, some of my feelings with my official positions as well here.
Speak in your personal capacity.
Personal capacity. Of course,
Remember,
in my
it's live
personal
streaming. Remember.
In my personal capacity, of course, we expect from a friendly and brotherly country, the most trusty, exactly. Yes, to respect the gender equality, exactly. So from one of the countries where traditionally our relationships are like cherished over the history, one of the most trusted allies Afghanistan has. Of course, we expect more from India, and we expect India to support from the position of the Afghan people and the Afghan government at the same time. Which the Indian government has been doing that, but as colleagues here said, I think they need to have more proactive role in this regard and engage with that, because our Afghan people, they have got some legitimate concerns that as a country that India built the house of democracy, the house of parliament in Afghanistan to preserve that. Will the Taliban really accept the elections? Of course they won't. So, I mean, what happens to that, to the parliament, for example, as a gift of the Indian nation? So that's why I think the people there as well, they expect the Indian government to have, more, to use all the leverages and the platforms they have at the international levels as well to lobby for the position of the Afghan people, the concerns that the Afghan people have. I think India, we should not underestimate, the power that India today has as a superpower. They can use all the platforms to lobby, for the concerns of the Afghan people, the legitimate concerns of the Afghan people that they have. And regarding the other question that Ambassador also pointed out to, I think when it comes to we have differences in Afghanistan. That shows how diverse a community should be, a society should be like, which here in India it applies to here as well. But when it comes to like national issues, like this one especially, for example, the name the Republic Islamic of Afghanistan. So every single Afghan would agree that we fight for that. And when it comes to, for example, an issue like peace, so no matter what differences, what political differences you may have, but when it comes to this, they are all on the same page. So that's why I think quite recently you mentioned as well that the Afghan, it was not, I think, late, the Afghan government had a consultative peace jirga where some 3,500 people, they attended, and the concerns, the roadmap is there. People drew up, their concerns, and they said what they want, what the negotiations should look like. So that's why I think now the base is that if the Taliban, they agree and engage with the Afghan government to start the intra-Afghan talk, so that the Afghan negotiators, they put forward the concerns and the demands of the Afghan people based on that roadmap.
Right, thank you. Jayant, would you like to say something?
I must say that the Afghans wanted to first sign with India a strategic partnership agreement before they did so with any other country, including the United States.
2011, I think. It was, huh?
But we have not responded as much to what they need. For example, on the military side, they have no medevac. No army can fight when a soldier knows that if he is injured, he cannot be taken to a hospital. So we can help in that. We can set up medical facilities. This is a problem we have with equipment, because we ourselves import equipment, heavy equipment. But we can supply things like mortars, which we manufacture in India. Similarly, Afghanistan doesn't have independent surveillance and intelligence capacity. We can supply those. We have satellites with very low resolution now. We have supplied these to Americans, but we have not supplied them to Afghans. That's very strange. We can start doing that now. I want to go back for a minute to your Taliban question and add a footnote, Amar, to what you said. All that you said, I agree. But we have to say India has no problem, Saad, with talking to anyone or working with anyone. When I was in Afghanistan so many years ago, before I left, I asked my political counselor to do a survey and tell me how many governors were from Hizb-e Islami out of 34 provinces. And we came up with a list that 17 of them were from Hizb-e Islami background. But my best relationships in government were with some ministers who were former Hizb-e Islami. So we can work with anyone. But will the Taliban give up its ideological and organizational links with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups? If they don't do that, we cannot have a talk with them. You may talk to them, but we cannot. Let that be very, very clear.
But maybe you should talk to your enemy, shouldn't you?
It's okay. We talk at some other levels, not at a formal level. Right. That is why I appreciated Ambassador Qadri's remarks, that we must respect the Afghan government.
Correct.
After all, who do they represent? They represent the Afghan people. And by talking to the Taliban, we undermine you completely.
Yeah.
We don't want to do what others are doing. We do our own thing in our own way. And people in Afghanistan know, even if we are not doing enough, I agree with you that we should do more. But even if we are not doing enough, the Afghans who matter know who their friends are and who their enemies are. And that's enough. And imagine when the whole world was talking to the Taliban, including the Americans, in 1999 and 2000. There were only 3 countries that were supporting those forces in Afghanistan who were opposed to the Taliban. India was one of them. We set up the hospital where Commander Masood was brought, unfortunately dead. I was also involved in that process. So it is not that India will not do anything. If we could do something when the whole world was with the Taliban and we were alone assisting those opposed to the Taliban, now when the whole world is with the Afghan government, why should we undermine the Afghan government and betray the Afghan people?
Right. Yes, ma'am. I think we are running. Can we take a few questions together, ma'am? You, Charlie, and then yeah.
And I really would like to thank Ambassador Mohsini, Mr. Jayan Prasad, and Mr. Mukhopadhyay just now to bring India back, because I think SARC is not lame duck as yet, and is the youngest. Afghanistan is the youngest country of SARC, and in that position, how is it that we cannot help our brother country? We have to take the initiative. I remember 20 years ago, Afghanistan would invite us and we would be very vocal on your initiative to help the Afghan country. But today we are silent. Afghanistan has no voice to tell us to please come and help us. And that time we were not friendly with the Americans, but today friendly with the Americans, we have no voice. How is that?
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
It's very intriguing, very intriguing.
Charlie, your question? Yeah. And after that, the gentleman there at the back, Varun.
Anand Sahai. I think this has been a very fascinating discussion about people who know a great deal about the place. They've lived there. They have.
Just speak into the mic.
They have they run policy, executive.
Just speak into the mic.
Policy and so forth. However, I think in the overall Indian approach, when Mr. Mohsini or Mr. Qadri, when they speak about India not having done enough, I take Ambassador Jayan Prasad's point and Gautam's point and all that about running down the Taliban, they ought to be run down. They have been in some ways, a Neanderthal force over a long period of time. But I think we should be careful when we are entering the area of theology, their theology. Is it the same as Al-Qaeda or is it not? Are they something like the Lashkar or are they not? Are they an offshoot of Jamaat Islami or are they not? I think they grew up. I mean, Pakistan did sponsor them. They are operating under the Pakistan umbrella. They have been for, from the start, right? But they were a set of country bumpkins, completely local level mullahs, and some of them, there was a reference made to Mohammadi, who was a part of the moderate faction in Peshawar at one time. So, they have been used as an instrument by Pakistan, and as such, they have done enormous amounts of harm. The Western powers looked the other way, even as America was there in Afghanistan trying to fight them. They did not prevent their regrouping and so forth. So I think one should not mix up this wider theological question about the Taliban with this immediate peace process and so on. This peace process is again a very, very tricky expression to use in my view. While President Trump, as has been rightly pointed out, was working towards his political calendar, here we were, the South Asia with the tempo of time in our minds. I don't, the reason why the whole thing fell through, I think what Amar was saying was quite right to some extent. They wanted the signatures there, first of all at Doha, before giving Trump the triumph of doing it at Camp David. But number two, there would also be the issue of whether or not if the Taliban were to come in, will it be on the understanding that they would tolerate continued American presence in Afghanistan or not? I think that issue has to also be factored in. But I'll come straight away to, I don't think this peace thing was really, somebody may take a stab at it once again in the foreseeable future. But I do not think that we are very close to anything of that nature, number one. Number two, India is a country which is loved deeply in Afghanistan, but I'm afraid, this is my impression, having been there for a bit, knowing a lot of political players there, I do not think that we really have sufficient political leverage in Afghanistan.
Okay.
And we can, if we wish to intervene in a positive, friendly way, the way is to help, if possible, if we can, aid that process, to bring all the non-Taliban Afghan factions together. That will be the bulwark against the Taliban's military force, which in effect is the Pakistani force.
Right.
Right? That will, if you do that, and then you look at the median age of Afghanistan today, 25, 26 years old, right?
Right.
So this new Afghanistan, as Mr. Mohseni was telling us quite appropriately, that Afghanistan, let us not talk about drawing of red lines and so on, but that Afghanistan will be a bulwark to the Taliban, I'm sure. There is still an Afghan army, battered though it is today, as compared to a few years earlier. But that is a role that India can conceivably play. Okay. It has not played. And as far as the Talibs go, from what I have understood, at the highest political levels, there have been entreaties made to New Delhi, and New Delhi.
Charlie, we have to wrap up. We have very little time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. The gentleman at the back, and then this young man in front. Yeah. And are there any more questions? I think the last. Are there any more questions? Yes, please ask your question.
Yeah, the question to the panel
coming up
is,
now.
would you agree with me that basically, as has been hinted, the whole issue is between the Americans and the Taliban? Because we have seen that Trump doesn't really care about or like Afghanistan, and even, I would say, the greater region, wants to get out, see the Taliban are the only ones who are really fighting. So he's interested in dealing with them, which means dealing with Pakistan, and he's not interested in talking to anyone else because he wants to get out and be done with it.
Can you just ask your question, please? I'm so sorry.
Would you agree with that, that
Okay.
basically nobody else can get into that dialogue?
Okay. Do you want to just say who you are? Because some people may not know.
Combe Carpentier, World Affairs.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead. And just say who you are, please.
Thank you. My name is Jawad. I'm a student.
Okay.
From Afghanistan. So the panel talked about on what President Trump might do, but the U.S. election is also coming up very soon. And in today's democratic debate, some democratic candidates, some of the leading ones, clarified their positions on Afghanistan. Senator Elizabeth Warren suggested that she would bring back troops without a deal, and Joe Biden suggested that we should have bases, that they should have bases in Pakistan to carry out counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan. So I wonder, how do you see the path that U.S. chooses in case a democratic administration comes in the next election?
Okay, thank you. Yes, go ahead. There are two questions here.
I'm from Afghanistan. I want to comment on former ambassador to Afghanistan. He said about Ahmad Shah Massoud. Sorry to say that you did not really help the Afghanistan, but you were supporting Ahmad Shah Massoud during the civil war in Afghanistan, he was not an elected leader or president. So you were only supporting a small community or a leader of a small community, which led to a bigger problem. So
Okay.
I'm sorry to say that.
Okay, no problem. What do you do? What's your name?
I'm Mukim from Afghanistan.
What do you do?
I'm a student.
Where?
Jamia Political Science.
Jamia, okay. You have a question? Okay, guys. Okay, let's, 1 second. Excuse me, I'm the one who's moderating this, not anybody else. No, acha suniye.
I said that.
Yes, Mukim, that's totally fine. You're allowed to say anything you like on this table. Yes.
That's where the beauty of India. You can say anything. But
Thank you.
Certain element of.
No, you can say what you like. Okay.
Thank you, ambassadors.
Yes. Do you want to just say who you are? Are you a student?
Nizamuddin Asar, research scholar at the Delhi University, political science.
Thank you.
I'm working on geopolitics of Afghanistan.
And you're Indian?
No.
You're Afghan?
Yeah.
Okay, you look Indian. Okay.
I have two questions. I'm here since 2013, that's why.
Okay. Kahiye.
So I have some questions about the, first of all, I'm agree with Ambassador about the Afghanization of the Afghan forces. That's where I see the solution of the problem for the current instabilities in Afghanistan. Like the expenditure upon one external soldier, the American soldier, is equal to 16 Afghan national military forces. And the other thing is that the mental maps of the Afghani soldiers are very beneficial to fight the internal forces like Taliban and other military groups there. And another thing is the uses and misuses of the definitions of terrorism, like the Taliban were terrorists. Now it again is like a political group in Doha.
Okay.
So their motivation comes to Taliban, and the demotivation comes to the Afghan military forces. And the next thing is
another question. Okay, you have to ask your question now.
Okay. So I will ask the ambassador. Mr. Ambassador, do we have a clear definition of Taliban? Are they terrorists? Are they our brothers?
Okay, Ambassador, we need a whole new session for that. But do you want to, young man, do you want to ask a question? Okay, shall we just take?
It will be one line question.
Kahiye.
There is one warlord living in Kabul. What's the name? Can anybody tell?
No.
There are many.
Okay.
There are many. One main guy.
Okay.
Islami. Hikmatyar.
Okay. Sir,
who you ask then.
Yeah. Sir, aap bataiye.
Thank you very much, ma'am. My question is to Ambassador Tahir. Sir, you are saying that election have to be held and peace have to be there. So before election or peace, you have to have your intelligence intact. So now you are a next.
सवाल पूछ लीजिए.
सवाल ही तो पूछ रहा हूँ सर. आप पूछने तो दीजिए.
जी, बस 5 मिनट है. 3 मिनट है.
All right. So as a next generation official, how far you feel that your intelligence in Afghanistan is right at the right path? Or are you satisfied, or you want something more to be done either from India side or from the allied side? Thank you,
sir. So shall we just have closing comments by everybody? Amar, would you like to start?
Yeah. About India doing more, answers were could.
My answer is the answer should be India should do more. It's not a question of could. On Taliban, the only flexibility they have shown is that they have at least come out and said that they don't want monopoly on power. Now, that is in their on their side, I could argue that's the only. Now, how truthful they are, we don't know. But at least that's what they have said, that they're willing to negotiate and share power and they don't want a monopoly. On engaging Taliban, see, our policy, and whether it's right or wrong, and I feel it is right, we have to remain one step behind Afghan government and people. The day they engage with Taliban, sure, go ahead and engage. Otherwise, as you rightly said, we are basically undermining the legitimate government in Afghanistan. And there is no harm. You don't have to take leadership in everything. It's for the Afghans to take leadership and you to play a supporting role. You don't have to be the Chaudhry in every situation. No, and because it's also our policy that the process has to be Afghan-led. So we can't say, while it should be Afghan-led, but we will take our own great initiatives because we are a great muscular country or an emerging power. On Masood, the question you asked, of course, it was addressed to Ambassador Jan Prasad. But let me ask, Masood, when you talk of Masood in Indian context, we don't talk of one ethnic community. We really are talking of somebody who symbolized the anti-Taliban forces. Now, we supported President Karzai as much. We perhaps support the current government as much as Masood. And if there is a leader tomorrow, and you can ask Ustad Sayaf or Asadullah or Nabil whether we supported them or not, or before that. Sayaf supported Masood. You see, exactly. So even today, whatever be the leadership or the coalition or a number of leadership, anything that we see as nationalist Afghans, no, I think India will fully support them. And we don't look at the ethnicity really in that way. So on you had asked, Yash, I don't know if he's there, he'd asked about our engagement with regional partners. Yes, of course it is on. It is with China, with Russia. We have regular dialogues. There are differences. We are trying to bridge them. One thing which has got very underreported in India is the role that Russia played in these peace talks. From my perspective, it was really Russia which democratized the peace talks, not only brought in the regional countries, including us, but also held the first forum where the Afghans interacted with Taliban. Of course, the entire narrative has been taken over by what the Americans are doing or Zalal Khalilzad, but there are other countries who are working and who are doing a great job. So we should not sort of undervalue their contribution. Cost of war, we have all, as ambassadors, argued that you cannot in South Asia fight a war of NATO standards. You have to bring down, and we know that President Ghani has brought it down to his estimates is $1.5 billion, what it will cost. Demotivating intelligence, etc. I leave it to him. So these were these three.
We've looked at some surveys, a pretty comprehensive survey conducted by a company in Kabul. It ranges between 60 and 75% of the population, depending on the demographic and age group and whether they're in cities or villages, of the Afghan public supports a peace deal. That goes without saying. People have had enough of fighting. It's been 40 years, 41 years. So I think everyone supports the peace process. I think the doubts come from A, lack of transparency, B, the impression that we're getting pushed under the bus. Now, the Americans have not been able to really secure any of the things that they had promised intra-Afghan talks. We haven't seen it happen. The Taliban get to have their prisoners released. They're going to pull their troops out. There is no ceasefire. I mean, initially they're going to have a reduction of violence in 2 provinces out of 33. So when most Afghans look at this, and there's no commitment on women's issues, there's no commitment on minorities, the question is, what are we getting? What are the Americans getting? So I think people want something more transparent and probably something which seems to, to us Afghans is something a bit more just in terms of a peace deal. By the way, people have suffered on both sides. People have suffered on our side. People have suffered on the Taliban side. There are casualties, civilian and military has been enormous, and some communities have suffered more than others, obviously. The question is, how do we go and execute this? This is the key. Now, unfortunately, Afghanistan is a country that people have either interfered or have been engaged for decades now. So, although Gautam has a fair point in terms of we don't want to get that involved, and it should be up to the Afghan government. If the Afghan government could conduct this on its own, it would be called the Swiss government. You know, we don't have that capacity, that wisdom, the institutions, the leadership to be able to pull this off on our own. One of the reasons we got to this stage, because the government failed to introduce an inclusive negotiating team. If anything, one of the problems right now is that the president is very isolated, is because he has upset so many of the other political players. A more inclusive approach, and this is where India can play a positive role. It has a good enough relationship with our different leaders that can actually encourage that sort of inclusivity. But of course, regional consensus is very important. How could you not talk to the Iranians? How could you not engage the Russians? How could you not engage the Chinese? And I think it's important for, we used to have 6+2, if you remember, years back. It's going to be a long road. The question is, will it be imposed on us and shoved down our throats, like the way Trump intended to, or will people be able to change his mind? He is a president who's inclined to change his mind, like he did on Syria. We don't know the answer to that.
Thank you. Well, regarding, I think the definition of terrorism is quite clear, so I don't want to just get on that, but whoever gives up bloodshed and atrocity and, joins a civilized life, I think the Afghan community is ready to observe that. Same it has done, in the past as well, many others who have joined our normal life, and they are taking part in democratic, processes. Regarding the other question, well, the Afghan National and Defense and Security Forces, despite all the challenges, they have been performing really well, very bravely fighting on so many fronts. So I really appreciate and kudos to all of them, all the heroes who have been fighting on many fronts. In Afghanistan, more than 20+ terrorist groups operate in the country. So now imagine all these brave soldiers, they are actually fighting with these terrorist groups and at the same time trying to protect the civilian lives in Afghanistan. So, for example, quite recently, despite the challenges, they have been able to push back the Taliban in many districts. So the Taliban, they are actually focusing to capture some of the very central provincial capitals, which they haven't been able to do that. And the intelligence-wise, they have been, of course, quite active and good as well. For example, they have stopped the Taliban from their illegal revenue tax collection, and the highways have been opened, as you might know. So I think the challenges are still there, but at the same time, with the capacity that they have, I think that is something that they can do. And at the end, I'm very optimistic about the future. I know that we are at a very important juncture again, so hopefully everything will be all right. With the generation that we have, with the young generation that we have, I'm sure that they will drive the future forward. Thank you.
I think I'll answer the question also, which was asked from you. Besides the United States and Pakistan, where the Taliban leadership currently resides, there is no other country really which is playing a decisive role in the current peace process, unfortunately. Despite the attempts by others to do so, actually they are not playing a role. Russia did try, but did not go very far with it. They probably know as much about what's going on in Doha than as what we know. We know from our Afghan friends, but they don't know fully also. Does India worry about a peace deal with Taliban? No, we don't. We are in favor of the reintegration of insurgents who give up violence, who resile from violence, who abide by constitutional and electoral processes. But we are against anybody who subverts Afghan democracy, which is a nascent democracy. We have a problem with those who will undermine human rights, particularly women's rights that you talked about, and destroy emerging Afghan institutions, which we have done a lot to build through our educational programs. What has India gained from our engagement so far with Afghanistan? I think we had lost our traction with the Afghan people in between, during the Taliban rule and after the Mujahideen went to Kabul in 1992. Slowly our connection was cut off. But now, to answer your question indirectly, we have been able to forge contact with Afghan men and women from the north in Badakhshan to the south in Kandahar, and from the west in Herat to the east in Nangarhar. We have been able to do that through our emphasis on human development and through a massive program of scholarships to build Afghan capacities. What do we want there? We want Afghans to stand on their feet and take their own decisions. And because if they do that, our strategic objectives are fully met. We don't want anything more. We want Afghanistan and Pakistan to have good relations. Because why are we interested in a good peace process? A meaningful peace process, which actually has not yet been engaged so far. In all the drama that is going on, there is no intra-Afghan negotiation so far. That will come later. We want that because if there is a Taliban rule in Afghanistan, or Afghanistan is taken over by terrorists, it will pose a far greater danger, not to India, but to Pakistan, where the very strong state structure, Afghanistan doesn't have a strong state structure, but Pakistan has. That will begin to unravel, and that will create more problems for us than what it will create for Pakistan or Afghanistan. So that's why we are vitally interested that Afghanistan should go back on the rails, and because we consider in India that any Afghan success is equally India's success. And I hope all of you know that.
Thank you. Let me say that I fully associate myself with Ambassador Prasad's last two interventions. Of course, I associate myself with everybody's comments on everything, but in particular those two. Quick two-liners on the points that are pending. One is a no-deal exit is still possible, but the US will still need a counter-terrorism strategy. It may have a temptation to go here and there, but there is the South Asia strategy. The Afghan National Defense Forces can play that role, and in fact, the United States should be nudged in that direction. Secondly, on the Afghanization of the forces, it's always struck me as ironic that the NATO forces, the fact is that it is the major powers that have never actually won a war in Afghanistan who are now teaching them the art of fighting a kind of counterinsurgency war. If you Afghanize the war, in fact, they will actually have their own answers. Third, on the withdrawal, a very important point. There is this, what actually President Trump is doing with the withdrawal is effectively saying, and with the counterterrorism guarantees, it's saying that terrorism against the United States is not permissible, but it does not matter if there is terrorism in Afghanistan. And this is their problem to solve. This completely cuts off the link between the kind of government that you have and the terrorists that you produce. Example, it was a Taliban government that produced Al-Qaeda that perpetrated 9/11. Is it imaginable that the present Republican government would do the same? So by cutting off this link is a very, very major, actually, point of principle. And lastly, I think a point that I've been struck right from the beginning. You know, one of the reasons why maybe people sense that we are not doing enough, and I'll say something, that we have done a lot. And it's not that we have not done enough. We have done enough, but we could do more. There's a crucial difference. And I think one of the reasons is the sense that you get from the international news and the bombings that somehow Afghanistan is a, in quotes, bad word, hopeless case. It is exactly the contrary. Having been in Afghanistan at different points of time, 1977, 2001, 2010 to 13, and very recently for the 100th anniversary of their independence day, I would like to second the point that Ambassador Tahiri made and end on that note, that Afghanistan is a very hopeful country. There is a new generation that we ourselves, and they are present here, have helped nourish and develop. And the old generation, sooner or later, by laws of nature, will go away. It's the new generation that will decide the future. And we have to be with the new generation.
Ladies and gentlemen, we couldn't have asked for a better discussion this afternoon. Gautam Mukhopadhyay, Jayant Prasad, Ambassador Tahir Qadri, Saad Mohsini, and Amar Sinath. Please give them a big hand.